Hey guys, it's Rachel. It is Thankful Thursday, and I know I didn't make a video last week, so I do apologise for that. I was kind of snowed under a little bit, and just kind of trying to organise a lot of things, including my clinical forms for my PhD. So that all needed sorting, and yeah, so I'm really sorry. Hang on, what can we see is happening here? So I'm sorry for the inconsistency with that, and I do apologise because I know that it can be frustrating to kind of be on and off. But this week, well, actually thinking about it, when I did make a video the other week, I did touch on moving schools because I know that last week that's what the girls covered. So this week we are actually going to be looking at post-traumatic stress disorder. Those of you who are not fully aware of it may wish to do some reading on it if you feel able to. It may be something that you don't actually feel comfortable doing or exploring yourself, which is perfectly reasonable also. So what I will do is put some links to some books that I have found incredibly helpful, some articles that I found incredibly helpful, and it is all to do with trauma and reenacting trauma on ourselves. And I guess that I do come from not necessarily a school of thought, but from a belief that when we are engaged in behaviours that can be eating disorder behaviours, it can be self-harm, it can be drinking, it can be promiscuity, it can be drugs, it can be a whole host of things, that we are in some way reenacting that trauma on our bodies, on ourselves, that in some way we have taken on that the abuse that was forced onto us, we are forcing it back onto ourselves, and in some way it can make us feel like we're gaining a sense of control over ourselves. And very often there are a number of people who feel that they are to blame for their trauma. I think I've discussed this either in a video on the channel or in a video which I used to have when I had my old channel, that they blame themselves. I actually never blame myself for what happened with me, which may seem a little bit strange, and there has been literature saying that one is more likely to recover from trauma if they do blame themselves, because those thoughts can be shifted and changed, whereas if a person doesn't blame themselves, it kind of leaves it out there and means that, well, how do we address that? How do we talk about what happened in a way that can help you heal when there is no process of challenging thoughts in many ways in terms of self-blame? What I would like to do here is to perhaps run through some of the symptoms or experiences that I've had with regards to post-traumatic stress disorder, and then the process of my recovery from that. What I will say to you is that very, very early on in my illness, I had only been struggling with my eating disorder for not even 2 years, maybe 2 years. And my therapist at the time, who I will always love and who I think is totally amazing, was very confident that I was struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the issue that she had at the time, and I distinctly remember her saying to me, "Rachel, I know that I shouldn't say this to you, but were you ever abused?" Now, at that point, I had no recollection of it. I know that things had happened to me. I knew that I had memories or thoughts, or I knew that I'd had this breakup. I knew that things had happened, but in terms of my conscious awareness, that wasn't there, or even if it was, I wasn't allowing myself that, because I was too wrapped up in my eating disorder, too wrapped up in self-harming, too wrapped up in caring about, you know, what weight I was. Or something I distinctly remember is the scars on my right leg, and a tape measure and wrapping it round them and using a specific scar to measure it. There was no room for anything else. And what you will often find with eating disorders is it's very hard to distinguish what to deal with, because you do need to deal with the eating disorder. You do need to confront that. And yet at the same time, how do you deal with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or even symptoms of something you don't understand? And so some of the symptoms you might find yourself dealing with, or if you're somebody who's watching this for somebody else, for me, it took approximately 6 years, and it was through 2005 that things really shifted. But in 2003, things kind of went a bit crazy, and that's when the hallucinations started, that's when the flashbacks started, and there were a huge amount of symptoms, but I personally didn't know what they were attached to. My therapist didn't know what they were attached to, and what they felt was necessary was for me to be in hospital. Unfortunately, there aren't services close to where I live that would be helpful, and so I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which then allowed me access to services, and I was sent up to York. I hated it. It didn't treat me for the issues that I was dealing with. And when I came home and started dealing with my eating disorder, gaining weight, and all the rest of it, in 2005, I was still having, well, it kind of stopped for a period of time, and I wasn't on medication, and I began to have very bad flashbacks, incredibly horrible flashbacks. My depression was worsening, and I basically needed to deal with the trauma. And I started to remember things, and I started to recall what could potentially be behind it. And that is when my amazing therapist, Angela, who I'd worked with for so many years, said to me, look, Rach, you know, this isn't me letting you go or abandoning you. I just feel you need to be with somebody who's a specialist in this field. That specialist in this field turned out to be Jaya, and that was somebody I worked with for at least 6 years. And I spent 6 years doing trauma therapy. So my eating disorder had been dealt with. I did have a relapse in 2007 when I was going through some very, very difficult things. That was caught very soon on, because she doesn't tolerate very much. And I slowly began the process of dealing, and it became more evident and more clear that the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder actually wasn't the issue. The issue was that I needed to confront my trauma. I needed to confront something that had changed me and had damaged me. And so slowly that process began, and it was a process that I partly controlled, but that was also driven by somebody else. And the process itself was awful. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to sit here and say to you, oh, by the way, you know, if you've got trauma to deal with, just go on your way and go and get some trauma therapy. It isn't as simple as that. And I refused to work with anybody else but Jaya, so she was my psychiatrist and psychotherapist. So we would have hour-long sessions, sometimes twice a week. And it, you know, the medication also helped. I mean, as soon as I went on Seroquel, quetiapine, which is actually a mood stabilizer, my flashbacks, hallucinations and difficulties with that, the sort of psychotic, they weren't psychotic breaks per se, but they were periods of dissociation, psychosis, where things just weren't quite right. And slowly I began to build a picture of what had happened to me. And what I realised when I was doing that is that it wasn't as simple as an event that happened to me. We ended up, with the school of thought that Jaya came from, we ended up going all the way back to my childhood. we discussed things in my childhood. I mean, I was a gymnast until I was 14. It was as abusive as anything. It really was. It was just awful looking back on it. And at the time, I didn't know any different. And I don't regret what I did and the sport that I dedicated myself to. But it was really fascinating to look through that as well, look through the relationship I had with my father, look at the experiences I had of being bullied in sort of through high school into college, feelings of letting people down, the feelings of worthlessness for not achieving what I should have achieved in my A-levels because what was going on at the time. And so it built up in a process, and disclosing some of the sort of sexual abuse, you know, was, that's the only word I have for it. It's awful. It's absolutely awful. And what I did with it for the most part was I would do a lot of writing, and I would take that to therapy with me, or I would draw. I mean, art therapy saved my life I don't know how many times. And when you're in this state of trauma and you know that there's stuff there but you can't articulate it, you can't remember it, I would use some form of creative therapy. I'm not saying you have to, but that would be my advice, because it is a means of communicating what is inside of you in a way that you are not completely conscious of. And some of it might not mean anything, some of it might mean everything. I worked with an art therapist for a long time, and she was an absolute godsend, and she no longer works. And I think you have to allow yourself to build up a relationship where you feel like you can build up some trust. And that was what it was for me. And as time went on with Jaya, I knew that she was there for me, and I knew that she would remain there for me. And I got through it, and life really opened up. And even at that point when I started work with her, I'd gone travelling in South Africa through 2005. And, you know, life just changed. And I certainly can say now that all of my trauma's behind me. Whatever issues that go on for me now have nothing to do with my eating disorder, have nothing to do with self-harm, have nothing to do with anything. Having gone through the trauma therapy, having gone through dealing with my eating disorder and all the rest of it, I'm simply left with a mood disorder. And that mood disorder, unfortunately, takes up a lot of my life. It takes up a lot of my energy. It is frustrating because I have worked so hard. Hang on, I've done that there. It's frustrating because I fought so hard to be well, you know, and I still think I'm in a degree of denial about having to deal with the ups and downs. But, you know, if you can deal with your trauma, get your behaviours under control, that's really only when you're going to figure it out. And some people go on, they have their therapy and they go on and they live their lives, which is what I'm doing. I've not been in therapy since, 2010. And my issues at the moment are to do with managing my mood through medication. So it's going to be hard work, and you don't even need an official diagnosis. And I will put some literature down, but just know that you're not alone, that you can talk to people about it, that there is no shame, and that you are worth it, and you deserve to give yourself the chance to deal with whatever's going on, and that you won't be judged for that. Okay guys, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'm going to give you a kiss, and I will see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.